Okay, there you go. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to have this at the start of the year. The work I'm going to talk about today, just a second. I'm not able to advance my slides. Okay, there you go. So the work I'm talking about today is by our wonderful PhD student, Becca Roberts, who I think is in the audience. Color constancy is the ability to identify surface color across illumination or viewing context. And as you can see in the graph on the left, this is sort of a hard problem because the light signal that enters the eye is a combination of the illumination spectrum and surface reflectance. And while we are really interested in the surface reflectance and not so much in the illumination, at least when we're trying to estimate object color, we need to constrain this computation in some way to be able to do this. Probabilistic models of perception posit that prior knowledge can be used to constrain perceptual estimation, for instance, over daylight. And this is related to what Anya was talking about earlier. And I will refer to this a little bit later on. But there are also image cues such as specular highlights that could be used as a potential source of information about the illumination. And we ask here whether such priors and cues are used in color constancy tasks and how they develop in children through to adulthood. So today I will talk about color constancy in 6 to 11-year-old children. I will talk about the developmental trajectory of constancy. I will talk about using of the daylight prior in both children and adults. And also I will show you some data on using specular highlights in color constancy tasks in both children and adults. So just some background on the development of color constancy. There are some studies on color constancy in infants, and these studies show that there is some kind of rudimentary form of color constancy. Infants are not fully color constant, but they can definitely recognize surface reflectance in some cases. There is not very much evidence or even studies on color constancy in children, but based on some studies, excuse me, we know that 2 to 4-year-olds have poorer constancy than adults, but there is some sort of anecdotal evidence reported by Cutts that 3 to 8-year-olds have equal color constancy to adults. So there is some disagreement about this. And generally, we know that priors in other domains than color can develop between 4 and 12 years, but to my knowledge, there is no data on the development of priors in color perception. So this is again, refers back to what Anya was explaining about daylight. Daylights vary from bluish skylight to yellowish sunlight. So there is this constraint in the variation of daylight. And it's possible that the visual system has learned this variation either in species development or individual development, and that we might use this knowledge to infer surface reflectance. But there is actually not very much experimental evidence on this. I should say direct experimental evidence, but some phenomena such as the dress and the individual variation in the dress might be explained by different expectations about the illumination. So in this first part, I will talk about our experiments studying the development of color constancy, and this lovely crocheted dragon is directed dragon, and it was made by our PhD student, Becca. So generally, general methods, we designed a child-friendly color constancy task, which is loosely based on the block sorting task by Radonjic et al., because we thought that using sort of traditional color constancy tasks, such as achromatic matching or asymmetric matching, would be pretty difficult in children. We chose 2 daylight illuminations and 2 illuminations orthogonal to the daylight axis. We used 4 surface reflectances. And in experiment 1, we used a simple 2D scenes, and in experiment 2, we used 3D rendered scenes. So in experiment 1, we had 33 children between 6 and 11 years of age and 26 adults. They were mostly young adults. To make the task more motivating and rewarding for children, we rewarded the children every 6 to 8 trials by giving them star figures to paste on a star chart. And we also regularly made sure that the children were willing to continue. The testing sessions for both children and adults lasted on average an hour, but due to fatigue, 28 experimental blocks out of 183 were not completed in children, and we took this into account in the data analysis. This is an example of a display in this experiment, which is divided into 2 fields. The left side is illuminated by, or it's simulated under a standard illumination, and the right side is simulated under a test illumination, which is green in this case, so it's not a daylight. Derek the Dragon is giving instructions. He was not present during the actual experiment, but he gave the instructions in the beginning. The target suite was shown on the left, and we had 8 competitors on the right. And the task was to feed Derek the Dragon his favorite suite from the options on the right. So basically the children had to choose, and the adults had to choose the stimulus on the right that matched the target suite. We didn't refer to color, but obviously color was the only variable changing here. So we assumed that the subjects made the choice based on the color. And I'm just going to explain a little bit about the colors. So one of the competitors was always the tri-stimulus match, meaning that it had the same chromaticity as the target. So if the subjects were not color constant at all, they would choose the tri-stimulus match. We also had the reflectance match, which had the chromaticity of the target simulated under the test illuminant. So the subjects should choose the reflectance match if they had perfect constancy. And then we had some, competitors between the two, and we also had some over and under constant competitors. And basically, depending on which of these competitors the subjects chose, we could calculate their color constancy index. We were a little bit worried about random responses, especially in children. So we took some measures to exclude conditions with random responding. So we basically looked at responses across suite colors for each subject, and we fit both a uniform and a Gaussian distribution to the responses. And if a uniform distribution was a better fit, or if the standard deviation of the distribution indicated a uniform distribution, we excluded that condition. In adults, we didn't have to exclude any conditions, but in children, a few % of the conditions were excluded in both experiments. Okay, I'm going to show you the results first, the color selections in a chromaticity diagram where U prime varies on the x-axis and V prime varies on the y-axis. The tri-stimulus match is shown with the black circle. So if there is no constancy, the data should be close to the tri-stimulus match. The reflectance matches are shown with the open circles, and the actual data, the average color selections, are shown with the circles. And there are actually error bars here, but the error bars are smaller than the symbols. So here you can see that none of the color selections are at the tri-stimulus match. So there is some color constancy, but it's not very much, and it depends on the illumination. So each of the different colors is a different illumination for this particular suite color. And here I'm going to show you the data for all the suite colors. And you can first see that for the gray suite, color constancy is about the same for all illuminations. So the little square field squares are about equally distant between the tri-stimulus match and the reflectance match. But for the other suites, constancy really varies depending on the interaction between the illumination and the reflectance. So for some illuminations and reflectances, constancy is really bad, and for some others, it's really good. So there is a strong interaction. Okay, let's look at the children's data next. I know that there are lots of subplots here, but maybe you can appreciate how similar the data for the adults and children are. So if you look at the data for a particular sweet color, you can see that the pattern of the data is almost identical. So there is some systematic variation in constancy as a function of surface reflectance and illumination that's very similar for children and adults. And next I'm going to show you the color constancy indices, which we calculated from the distance between the average color selection and the perfect constancy match. And I'm plotting constancy index here on the y-axis and the different illuminations on the x-axis. And the lighter colored bars are for adults and the darker colored bars are for children. And first you can see that there is this pattern across the illumination. Constancy is not the same for all illuminations. And you might be able to see also that constancy is actually higher for children than for adults. And this was really significant. And this was really surprising. So we were really not expecting to find this. And as I said, there was this main effect of illumination. And in both age groups, constancy was best for the blue illumination. And actually it was worst for the yellow illumination. What about the developmental trajectory? So here I'm plotting color constancy index as a function of age separately for children and adults. And both the data for children and adults are ordered across age. So all adults are over 18, but they are ordered according to the age. And we fitted a linear regression to both data sets. And we found that there was a linear decrease in the constancy index for children with age for all illuminations, but there was no change for adults. So basically constancy decreases linearly from 6 to 11 years. Next, we modeled the change by combining the data for children and adults. So here I have color constancy index on the y-axis and log age on the x-axis for combined children and adult data. And we used different models to fit to this data. We used a linear model, a jump model, a hockey stick model, and a no change model. And we found that for the blue and the red illumination, a jump model fit best, where there was an abrupt decrease in constancy around 8.5 years. And for the yellow and green illuminations, there was a linear decrease. So to summarize this experiment, we surprisingly found better color constancy in children. We found a decrease for all illuminations across age, but with different trajectories. But what was also really interesting and important, we found the same pattern of constancy for different surface reflectances and illuminations for both age groups. And we found partial evidence of a daylight prior, or maybe rather evidence for an asymmetric daylight prior, where constancy was best for the blue illuminations, but worse for the yellow illuminations in both age groups. Okay, so we wanted to see whether we can replicate these results in a slightly more realistic display, where we had essentially the same methods, but we rendered the stimuli in 3D. And in this experiment, we had 26 adults and 40 children in the same age range. We had additional instructions in this case. So before, we hadn't explained to subjects what is actually changing when the color changes on the screen. But in this case, we explained before the experiment with this image that the changes in the display are actually due to illumination changing. So we changed the illumination on the left, and at the same time explained to the subjects that, okay, you're seeing a color change, but that's due to the illumination. And we thought that this might have improved their color constancy overall. I'm showing you the results in the same format. So here, again, each column shows the results for a different sweet color. You can see that, again, the pattern is very similar for adults and children. So there is some intermediate level of color constancy that depends on the illumination, but it's very similar for both age groups. And that is the case for all of these sweet colors. So there is, in some cases, very, very strong interaction between illumination or reflectance, where, for instance, for the green suite, constancy is best for the green illumination and worst for the red illumination. But again, very similar pattern for both children and adults. We also found very similar color constancy indices. Again, we found that constancy was higher for children than for adults, although in this case, constancy was overall lower, surprisingly. So we actually found lower constancy with the 3D display compared to the 2D display. And again, we found that constancy was best for the blue illumination in both age groups. Okay, let's look at the developmental trajectory in this case. We again fitted a linear regression to the children's data, and we found that in this case, constancy decreased linearly with age for the blue and red illuminations, but not for the green and yellow illuminations. And when we modeled the data together with the adults, we found that in this case, a linear model explained the developmental trajectory for the blue, red, and green illuminations, but there was no change for the yellow illumination. So children were equally bad as adults for this illumination. So to summarize, we found essentially the same results. We found that constancy was better for children, that it was best for the blue illumination, and that there was this strong interaction between surface reflectance and illumination, but no three-way interaction with age group, meaning that this pattern was the same or very similar for children and adults. So the only difference really was that the developmental trajectories were not exactly the same, but broadly we found the same results. In the next part, I will briefly talk about the use of specular highlights to achieve constancy, where we used the same child-friendly task and 3D scenes. First, a quick word about why specular highlights would help in color constancy tasks. If you look at the graph on the right, the dot in the middle, which a red arrow is pointing to, shows the illumination chromaticity. And the little squares that you might be able to see show the body colors or diffuse reflectances of different surfaces. And the little triangles show the chromaticities of the specular highlights. And you can see that the chromaticities of the whole stimulus, the pixel chromaticities, fall between the body color and the specular highlight, and that these lines are pointing towards the illumination. This is something that's called chromaticity convergence, and that has been suggested to help in color constancy tasks. So if the visual system is sensitive to this image cue, we would expect to find higher constancy for scenes with glossy objects. And indeed, we actually found recently that adults have higher constancy in scenes with glossy objects when other low-level cues are weakened. And I'm just going to quickly run through those results. We had matte and glossy scenes where either all shapes were matte or all shapes were glossy. And in this case, we had a checkerboard background. So we sort of tried to eliminate the local contrast cue from a uniform background. We had subjects do achromatic matching under 5 different illuminations, and the matching patch could either be on the shape or on the wall. And we found significantly higher constancy for scenes with glossy objects. So in this graph on the right, matte data, matte color constancy index is shown with gray bars, and glossy is shown with light bars, and position is on the x-axis. So when the subjects were doing the match on the shape, that's shown on the left, and when they were doing the match on the wall, that's shown on the right. You can see that regardless of the position of the patch, constancy was better for the glossy scenes. So we inferred that subjects were sensitive to this specular highlight cue. And here we asked whether we find the same in children. And this is preliminary work where the data collection was halted due to COVID-19, so we have very little data. So this is very preliminary, but I still wanted to show you this because it's quite interesting. So in this figure, again, color constancy index is shown on the y-axis, and age group is now on the x-axis, where adults are the left 2 bars and children are the right 2 bars. And now matte constancy for matte scenes is shown with light gray, and for glossy with dark gray. And in this case, we found a non-significant trend for adults, where constancy was higher for glossy scenes. And for children, we found the opposite. And these results are not statistically significant, but we found this trend interesting, that it's possible that children are not able to use the specular highlight cue, although their constancy otherwise is as good or better than for adults. So to summarize, we surprisingly found better constancy than for adults in simple 2D and 3D scenes. And of course, we were really surprised. We were not expecting this result. And we started to think that maybe this is due to different strategies. And maybe it's that children are genuinely trying to do a reflectance match, whereas adults, maybe because it's quite an it's not an immersive scene and it's quite an artificial display, maybe they're actually trying to do a tri-stimulus match or appearance match. And that would lead to lower color constancy indices. And of course, this is really just speculation. And we need to investigate this further with systematic manipulation of scenes and instructions. And maybe it would actually be interesting to measure eye movements, because it's also possible that children and adults have different patterns of eye movements when they're switching from the left side to the right side of the display. We found evidence of a bluish daylight prior, which is broadly in line with what Brainard et al. And Pierce et al. Have reported. So this was not super surprising, but I think we can put the rest a notion of a broad daylight prior, which sort of extends to the yellow direction as well. What I found really interesting is a similar pattern of constancy for both age groups, where there are these systematic interactions between surface reflectance and illumination that seem really robust. And we found this very tentative evidence that children do not use the highlight cue, which leads us to this general conclusion that fundamental constancy processes seem to have developed by 6 years of age, but it's possible that using more complex cues such as highlights may develop more slowly. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank all the funders and all my co-authors, and I'm really happy to take questions.